Hello, hello. Ken Lane here for another one of my API Evangelist conversations where I just have people come by to talk about the interesting things that they're doing with APIs. And let's not waste any time. Let's see who we've got here today. Let's dive in. Hello, who are
Hello.
you?
Hi, I'm Adrian Machado. I'm a staff engineer at Zuplo. We work in, the API management space, and primarily my role is, I guess I could describe it as like growth, anything it takes to grow the company. These days, that involves a lot of like content creation and sort of like writing about influential topics that either developers or API leaders care about and helping them stay informed and up to date.
Yeah, big fan of your work. I would say what you guys do reflects what I try to do. I don't have a tool or a platform or anything solid to offer, but trying to make things hands on and relevant and an equal mix of stories as well as artifacts and things that you can do to actually like make things go home and apply things. So I'm always appreciative of what y'all are building. And recently you're talking about rate limiting, which is I think crosses over into several areas of standards and governance that I really care about, from headers and header literacy and developers just knowing about headers. But rate limiting is kind of something that's essential. It's part of every API, but there's not really a lot of standardization out there. So what give our listeners a little overview of what you guys published.
Yeah, so I recently wrote a sort of comprehensive guide to API rate limiting. And as a part of that, I talked about like, the standards around communicating your API rate limits. So, the obvious question is like, okay, why should I be communicating my API rate limits? And that kind of comes from the view where like rate limits are purely like a security feature of your API. And, I guess that kind of boils down to sort of the thinking that APIs are just like an infrastructure piece and gateways are just like an infrastructure piece, right? Rather than being part of your product strategy. So, I take the view that rate limits are actually kind of a feature of your platform, the fact that you can enforce them, because they avoid resource starvation, they avoid, noisy neighbors affecting like other customers. It just improves like the overall quality and response times of your APIs when implemented correctly. And they can even play like a further role in terms of like how you actually go about like go to market for your API in terms of how you monetize it. Can you offer higher or different rate limits for higher tier customers? The enterprises are going to have different needs than your typical self-serve user, right? You probably want to be more restrictive on like your free tier with rate limits to avoid, people trying to mine Bitcoin or something like that with your API. There's like so many different abuses that can happen. So depending on your level of trust, you want to have different rate limits. Depending on the type of API you want to have something like complex rate limiting, where you rate limit, let's say you have a file storage API or like Dropbox or something like that. You don't want to just rate limit on requests. You probably want to be rate limiting on the number of kilobytes of the files that are being uploaded and downloaded to avoid, people using it for streaming movies or something like that. You know what I mean? So it's not just about avoiding misuse. It's about like guiding developers on how to use your APIs and opening up higher rate limits or different rate limits depending on the use case.
Yeah, so you hit on a really interesting intersection there, because rate limits are often a technical detail that developers have to worry about. It's or may or may not know about. It's usually in headers. It's kind of behind the scenes a little bit. So it's definitely a technical piece. But you touched on how it intersects with your plan, and then your process of what you just described very much is like, for me, why you do this is because you are planning and you're like thinking about your users and your consumers, and you're constructing plans and thinking about what they need and how they're going to use it. And that's the whole practice of monetization that a lot of folks need to go through to like think of this. So you're bringing it out of that technical and into the kind of business realm, and as something that folks should have to think about.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes to, thinking of API as a product, that term is thrown, around a lot. But what I think of it as being is how do we merge like technical requirements that engineers care about with the dollars and cents that your product managers and business leaders are going to care about? And I think rate limiting is like an intersection there because one, it could be, yeah, a monetization lever when you control them together. But if you're doing something like complex rate limiting, or maybe dynamic rate limiting, depending on like the customer. There are engineering applications on there. So, the PM may have one idea, like, oh, this is really good, we should try build this into monetization model, but then you need to have like the tooling and infrastructure to support that, right? So finding that right balance is, API as a product. I'd say, what is your like go to market strategy and what's feasible? And I think part of that is like how you communicate your rate limits as well.
Yeah, I mean that bridge between the product and the engineering, I think, is essential. But it's still a very technical thing that is. I see a lot of different ways to rate limit and a lot of different. I mean, I profile and see a lot of APIs, and I don't always see a lot of consistency. So, are we going to have to standardize this? I mean, is that what you're proposing? Is that we need to be thinking a little bit more about standardizing?
Yeah, and I think of, there's already some efforts around standardization within the rate limiting space. So I'd sort of like describe them as being kind of like different tiers. There's like a bronze tier, silver, gold, and platinum. Starting with like the bronze tier, I'd say is the fact that you have rate limits is good, and the fact that you send back like a 429 response. I think that's okay. You know what I mean? It's like that's like the bare minimum communication that you can have, and maybe within your like API docs, whether you're using like like Milify, Zudoku, or whatever, you like mention it in like one line where you have like, oh, these are like our rate limits for like our API. That's really restrictive, I'd say, like for like a business. The fact that you have it as in like a static documentation format, because that means that if you want to update it, you probably have to create like a breaking change for your API. It also makes it hard for you to like have different rate limits for different parts of like your API. Maybe you offer different APIs that need rate limits on different things, whether it's like concurrent connections or AI tokens, right? So just having it within like one section of your docs is restrictive, and not communicating that dynamically, I think, is restrictive. So we move into kind of the next level of communication. That kind of involves sending back like a more detailed error message, typically using the standard of problem details. I forget like the RFC for problem details now, but essentially it's just a JSON body that you send back that tells you, okay, what type of error is this? What's the error code? And here are some details about it, and like a trace that you can go and reference within your support tickets, right? So if your customers are running into this, they can, manually read the information of like, hey, you hit a 429 because you sent, I don't know, 1,000 requests when your limit is 900 or something like that. When we want to move beyond that, I'd say though, where like engineers need to be manually inspecting like arbitrary JSON bodies to understand how to use your API, especially when, it's not going to be people using APIs a lot of times going into the future. It might be like AI agents that are consuming it, right? Or maybe you want to have tooling that actually adapts to rate limits. So that's when we move into, I'd say, like the kind of gold tier approach. By gold tier, I don't mean this is like actually that great. It's just better than most people, where you include like a retry after header, and that header typically indicates how long you have to wait until you have to try that request again, right? So typically this is a amount in like seconds. So like 3,600, okay, you have to wait like an hour before you can start sending a request again. So if I'm like a, someone who's writing like an API wrapper or like an SDK, I would definitely use that property. My code would pick up on that and be like, okay, I'm going to chill out on sending client-side requests until then. And that's going to introduce some front-end latency. But maybe you can have, let's say, like a hook in React that hooks into that and displays like a loading screen in between. You know what I mean? I can report the status back to you programmatically. And the fact that this is dynamic now and works can be used programmatically, I think that's very powerful for delivering a good user experience for your end users.
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of the technical aspects of this, I think, as far as standardization, consistency, like why this contributes to reliable systems. And then, previously you were talking about the business, and I'm trying to constantly create those reasons why enterprise leadership, business leadership wants to invest in APIs and create those reliable systems and carve out the space so people can invest in standardizing using rate limits and problems, JSON problems, details, and so that's the really important part of this. But the other thing you touched on the AI agents piece, and for me, service composition, which isn't a new term, it's the old API management providers were using this, and then it kind of faded away. Is I have a path or a set of paths. One, how do I make that available? Bundle it with rate limits, so it's got a kind of a business composition as well. And I've got
Yeah.
this header rate limit. who's going to use it. I'm going to give it to this group and they need it for this reason. And you've had to adapt that over the years. It's web to mobile to kind of device and IoT. There was a lot. And then you guys do a lot of regional. So I see a lot of people who do, hey, I need this for Germany. I
Yeah.
need this for, so you bundle that in different ways. But how am I going to do that? The question I'm getting from a lot of my customers is, how am I going to do that, make money off of my data, my digital resources in the AI age? What are my concerns when it comes to this?
Yeah, I think that making your API as understandable by AI as possible is important. And I think there are some sort of standards emerging around this, around like better communication around your API. Some people are of the opinion that we should radically simplify like our documentation. There's like the sort of proposed standard of LLMs.txt, the sort of successor to robots.txt, where it's literally just a plain text file stripped of like any HTML or whatever that just is just pure text on, let's say, how your API operates. I think that this is sort of like a very transitional standard, and I don't think it's going to stick around for long, in my opinion, because I think agents are going to get smarter. They're going to be able to render JavaScript, and more importantly, they're going to need like dynamic information rather than just static information. It's the same problem as just documenting your rate limits within, um, just within your docs. Is okay. That's a one and done thing, but agents can be interactive. They can keep they want to know different information bespoke to your API. And if you have different rate limits documented in like weird ways within like a arbitrary text file, it's going to be hard for them to even understand, right?
Yeah.
So Daryl Miller, for example, he's created like this new standard around rate limiting headers that can be dynamically sent to you via headers. They'll tell you what quotas are being used by like your current API call, the time window of like the reset, how many items within that quota you have left, whether that's like AI tokens or kilobytes in file upload or requests,
Mhm.
and when that's going to be reset. And I think that agents will actually be able to use that information for making these calls to be a smarter consumer. Whether that's in terms of picking what plan that you're going to be using. Okay, I know what the rate limits are between the enterprise tier and the business tier. And then when actually, consuming that API as part of like their agent workflow, they can actually like dynamically adapt to that in a better way. Maybe they can write an API wrapper or like choose to make calls selectively based on those headers that are coming back. In fact, maybe AI agents will be better consumers of API than current tooling that's out there right now, and most people who are just using like Postman to like arbitrarily fire off requests. So I think that dynamically communicating your API and documentation on an ongoing basis will put you further ahead in terms of like supporting agents.
Yeah, definitely. That Daryl knows the stuff when it comes to those headers and what's needed, and I think the injecting more of the business layer into those headers, as far as not just how much you're using. How much does this cost? I noticed the DeepSeek API, AI API had one endpoint just for what's my spend. And so, like, I think there's a lot of that business layer and the technical that needs to be in there, the terms of service, the privacy. We need to get, and then there's auto registration. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
a lot of concerns that have to be worked out at that layer. But I think rate limit gets at the technical and the business concerns that kind of matter the most. So what right now is exciting you the most when it comes to doing all this and working on all these content and conversations and projects? What's coolest to you?
So I think that's what's cool is the fact that I can take a look at these standards and actually implement them within our platform at Zuplo to actually move API development forward. I find that there's a little bit of divide where we have had these like RFCs coming out like every year about whether that's like deprecation and sunset headers or rate limiting headers now, but adoption is like primarily limited to enterprises that are like API first, I'd say. So like Telnix is one company that's adopted one version of these like headers, but then the RFC changed, and now I don't know if they're going to go and change their APIs like accordingly, right? And it's hard. It's hard to adopt these. It's hard to like prioritize that from like a business standard. Like, oh, how do I justify like this? So what I try to do at Zuplo whenever we implement something is try to adapt to these standards in such a way that like it's seamless when you add like let's say your rate limiting policy to Zuplo, we automatically create like a retry after header for you that automatically gets sent by. You don't even have to think about it because we have like the control of like the implementation that you can configure, obviously. But you don't have to think about adopting best standards. We're opinionated as a platform to force the industry to move forward, adopting standards. And the more we adopt standards, as we've seen with Open API, the more tooling becomes justified and flourishes. Right now, we have so many other tools that are created off of Open API because as an industry, we kind of came together and pushed those standards forward.
Yeah, and I think to use a term you guys are really good at is the edge, and for pushing this edge forward of standardization is, I think people think of sovereign, data sovereignty and regional concerns as far as like the the governments and the restrictions and the regulations in those. But what I would like to see is at the enterprise level where they could take Zuplo and go, okay, here's a kind of maturity level zones. Is like if you want to operate in the grown up zone, you've got to follow these standards and have these and the way you guys do your policies and have that in place. You could have varying grades maturity, and you can start in the sandbox or the kindergarten or the playground as far as producing and publishing APIs, but then you have to kind of mature in policies as you progress into the more grown up zones as well. So that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'd like to call this sort of, I don't know, third wave of API management, which I'll probably talk about in a talk in the future. I think new tooling is coming out now that focuses on developer experience, radically simplifying things that are like hard before, decoupling and unbundling of different features, and currently these startups, so I'd say like, Speakeasy and Stainless on the SDK side, Fern and Mintlify on like the doc side, they're all kind of picking at different parts that have like traditionally been like difficult to do, making it harder, or sorry, making it easier to solve like these issues around like API tooling. And as they mature, I think like they'll move up market, they'll be able to serve better enterprises. And the end result will be a new generation of API tooling, whether they end up consolidating in the future or maybe they stay like unbundled, that enables you to like have high quality APIs with like a fraction of the effort that it used to take to do this.
Yeah, yeah, no, and that iteration, you got to do it small. You got to do it. I kind of see what Open API has done for APIs. You guys kind of doing for the gateway with Open API is make it something that's composable and reusable, and you can do as little or or as much of it as you want in a zone, in a region, with a set of policies, and try new things and then experiment, and so I think that experimentation is going to be really important.
Yeah, I agree. And that all comes back to like standards and tooling. Um, Traditionally, I think the advantage of like a lot of these startups, including ourselves at Zuplo, is our nimbleness in as far as like adopting standards and tooling, whether it's like Open API or problem details or Open Telemetry. There's kind of like dinosaurs in the API world, especially the ones owned by like the big boxes that are slow to adopt these. Customers, I think, can understand like the benefit of like these open standards, like Open Telemetry, for example, and they'll choose like the startup instead because like the developer experience is that much better, adherence to new standards of tooling is that much better. That is our competitive advantage compared to like the AWS API gateways of the world, which are like almost the default option for most people.
Well, and I just published a piece on you guys, not squabbling over the commoditized scraps, I would say, which is documentation should be free. And you
Yeah,
guys focus on this edge and offer documentation for free with Zudoku. So I appreciate that.
yeah, I think that if we want to have a better ecosystem, some components are going to have good free offerings. And that's like our thinking with Zudoku. Um, we think that the current standard of people using, let's say, uh, what's like the Smart Mare open source version, I forget what it's
Swagger UI.
yeah, Swagger UI. I see that very often used by like these hobbyist developers, and it's even baked into platforms like Fast API, for example, or frameworks, I should say. Um, but I don't think anyone loves it. It's just the fact that it's the free thing that's out there, and it works. Like I'm not saying it doesn't work. It's out there, but it's not how would I put it? It very much strikes me as when you see that, it's like, okay, this person did not think very deeply about what like the flow is going to be. And you know, if I think about you, if you're like selling an API as a business, whether you're a hobbyist or you're like a large company, um, that's going to be sort of like the first experience that developers get with you. If they see like they have the free tier Swagger, um, Open API docs there, they're going to be like, hey, I think they just code gen a doc and put it together. They didn't think too much about it. Whereas when they see like, I don't know, OpenAI's API documentation, like, okay, this is a professional API. This is the one I'm going to pay for. This is the one I trust. So you can think about it being like the homepage for your business, your API docs. And that's why we want to raise the bar by introducing Zudoku as like a high quality free version. So we elevate, the hobbyists out there or the startups out there to have better experiences.
Yeah, definitely agree. I harvest a lot of Swagger and Open API artifacts. And when someone publishes it with Swagger UI still in the title and the
Yep.
docs, and it doesn't even say their name of their API, they didn't put a lot of thought or effort into what they were doing. So,
Yeah. And it's not that their API is bad. They were just focused on like the implementation
yeah.
probably. They're not marketing people. They're not like front end devs, but that's kind of what we want to commoditize is the ability to generate like a good front end UI. You just know for Zudoku, you just need to know Markdown, and maybe some like tweak some CSS variables and you're kind of off to the races. The default is beautiful, I guess.
Yeah, agreed. Well, good stuff, man. I appreciate you coming by and talking with me, and look forward to talking more at this. I don't know. The edge you guys are pushing forward is where it's going with gateways. It's just we gotta wait for the whole rest of the industry to catch up with y'all. So
That's what we're hoping for is that I think Edge has been a little bit sleepy in some ways. There's been like a little bit of a retraction. People are like, oh, like Vercel or Terso, for example, like, oh, we're not too sure about like the Edge or where it's going. But I think for the API use case where you quite often just need to like be very close to your customers to deliver unparalleled latency, I think it is the way to go.
yeah, agreed. Well, I appreciate you coming by, Adrian. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, cheers. Yeah, big fan of what they're building over there. It's definitely that edge capabilities, get spec driven. It's kind of how you need to be thinking about your gateways if you're going to be iterating rapidly. And I don't care whether you're doing AI or whatever else you're doing. It's definitely good stuff. All right. Thanks everyone. Talk to y'all later.